the human rights violations we are seeing in Xinjiang province with the Uyghur people are not the only violations of human rights that we are seeing being perpetrated by the Chinese Communist regime. You mentioned Falun Gong. There's also long-standing human rights abuses against the Tibetan people just south of Xinjiang. There's violations of the rights of other minorities in mainland China, as well as violations of rights and international treaties in Hong Kong. And so we think it's long past time for the Liberal government to take a much stronger stand on China, to make it clear that the threats to our citizens, such as the detention, the wrongful, unlawful detention of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spaver, as well as Canadian Hussein Jalil, is unacceptable, and that there will be repercussions for these threats to our citizens, to our companies, but also these threats to our fundamental values, values that are universal, values that are enshrined in the UN system. And so we think it's long past time for the Liberal government to take a much stronger stand on China, like our allies have already done. Canada and other democracies like Canada were wrong about one thing after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the changes that we saw that came about in the Soviet Union and changes that came about as a result of the great reopening of China. And what we were wrong about was that we made the assumption that by welcoming countries like China into the economic system, that we would help them gradually improve their record on human rights, on democracy, and on the rule of law. Well, I think 30 years after those assumptions were made, we were clearly wrong. We were right that in opening up our economies to trade, to investment, through trade deals and through investment agreements, that we would mutually benefit both our respective countries. I think that assumption is true and has come to be. It's clear that over the last 30 years, the globalization of trade, the globalization of investment has led to an unprecedented period of increases in prosperity on both sides of the equation for countries like China and other developing countries. But that second assumption, that by bringing them into the global trading order, we would help them gradually, through osmosis, improve their human rights record, their respect for the rule of law, and that they would gradually democratize, has been wrong. All they have done in the last 30 years is use their newfound prosperity to reinforce their authoritarianism, to reinforce their persecution of minorities, such as Falun Gong practitioners. And so we have to acknowledge that we were wrong on that assumption and come forward with a new approach, a new policy on authoritarian regimes like China that better defend human rights, better protect our citizens, our companies, and that's what we've been calling on the Liberal government to do. First, let me say that we are very concerned about the trial of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spaver, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spaver. Trials in China are large show. The conviction rate is essentially 100%. And so we're very concerned about this news that they were going to be put on trial. Second thing I want to say on this is that we believe that the government needs to strongly reiterate its call that these detentions are unlawful, that they are a violation of international treaties, and that China must immediately release Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spaver. And finally, we call on the government to work much more closely with our allies to seek the release of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spaver. We have to work closely with allies like the United States to help us secure their release. Small countries like Canada and Australia need to work multilaterally in order to prevent us from being isolated and threatened by the Chinese Communist regime in Beijing. I find the current government's approach to China puzzling for a number of reasons. But there's one thing that, one of those reasons that's always puzzled me is that Canada is the world leader in dealing with asymmetrical relationships. We are a global expert, more than any other country in the world, about dealing with an asymmetrical relationship. And that is the relationship with the United States of America. So, for example, when the previous Trump administration put tariffs on Canadian aluminum exports to the United States, within hours, the Canadian government was out there forcefully saying that we would be coming forward with countermeasures, countervailing measures to push back, to punch back against what we saw as an unfair attack on our aluminum companies. And we do that all the time. When the United States takes certain measures, we respond in kind, and we do so confidently and strongly. But with our relationship with China, we don't do that at all. Whenever Canada gets threatened by China, the current government's approach is passiveness and equivocation. And that's even more puzzling in light of the fact that the United States is still a much bigger superpower than China is. The United States is still 50% bigger economically. It's still a much more powerful military than is China. And so the government's passiveness and equivocation in the face of China's threats is puzzling when we look at its response in the face of threats and challenges to our interests from the United States. So that's the final thought I'll leave you with. Thank you very much for having me.